Monaco Palace, 3:17 de la mañana, September 1962. Grace Kelly stood frozen in the marble hallway, her silk nightgown clinging to her trembling body. Through the crack in the study door, she could see everything. Her husband, Prince Rainier, pressed against the wall with a woman who was definitely not his wife. A woman Grace recognized immediately. Maria Callas, the opera singer who had been their house guest for the past month. Grace's wedding ring caught the moonlight streaming through the palace windows. 6 years of marriage, 3 children. A fairy tale that had fooled the entire world. But fairy tales, Grace was learning, were just elaborate lies told to naive little girls. What she did in the next 5 minutes wouldn't just destroy her marriage, it would bring down the most powerful monarchy in Europe and reveal secrets that 3 governments had spent millions to hide. The ice princess was about to melt, and when she did, the entire world would burn. Grace pressed herself against the cold marble wall, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they would hear it, but Rainier and Maria were too absorbed in their passion to notice anything else. "You promised me," Maria whispered, her voice carrying the same dramatic intensity she brought to the opera stage. "You said you would tell her." Rainier's response made Grace's blood freeze. Grace is useful for now. The American press loves her, but Monaco needs more than a pretty face from Hollywood. Grace bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. Useful. That's what 6 years of marriage had made her. A useful, pretty face. "And after?" Maria pressed. "When will we be together properly?" Grace didn't wait to hear the answer. She had heard enough. But instead of crying, instead of confronting them, instead of doing what any normal wife would do, Grace Kelly did something that proved she was no ordinary woman. She smiled. The next morning arrived with Mediterranean sunshine streaming through the palace windows. Grace sat at the breakfast table, perfectly composed, reading Le Figaro while sipping her coffee. When Rainier entered, she looked up with that famous smile that had charmed Hollywood directors and European aristocrats alike. "Good morning, darling," she said sweetly. "Did you sleep well?" Rainier looked slightly uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. "Yes, quite well. You, like a baby." Grace folded her newspaper. "I was thinking we should throw a dinner party this weekend. Something intimate. Perhaps Maria would like to join us?" If Rainier was surprised by his wife's suggestion, he didn't show it. I'm sure she would be delighted. What Rainier didn't know was that Grace Kelly had already made 3 phone calls that morning. Calls that would set in motion a chain of events that would rock the European establishment to its core. The first call was to her old friend Hedda Hopper in Hollywood, the same gossip columnist who had helped her destroy Vincent Sherman years ago. The second call was to a private investigator in Paris, a man who specialized in photographing the indiscretions of the wealthy and powerful. The third call was to someone even more dangerous. Her father, Jack Kelly, the Olympic rower who had built a construction empire in Philadelphia and had connections that reached into the highest levels of American government. Grace Kelly had learned something during her years in Hollywood and Monaco. Information was the most valuable currency in the world, and she was about to become very, very rich. But first, she had a performance to give. That evening, Maria Callas joined the royal family for dinner. She wore a stunning black dress that emphasized her dramatic beauty, the kind of woman who commanded attention simply by breathing. Grace watched her husband's face carefully throughout the meal, the way his eyes lingered on Maria's lips when she spoke, the way he found excuses to touch her hand when passing the salt, the way he positioned his chair just slightly closer to hers than protocol demanded. It was a masterclass in subtle seduction, and Grace had a front-row seat. "Maria," Grace said during dessert, her voice perfectly calm. "I understand you'll be staying with us for another week?" Maria glanced at Rainier before answering. "If it's not too much trouble, Your Serene Highness?" Grace smiled that enigmatic smile that had made her famous. "No trouble at all. In fact, I insist. I find your presence here absolutely illuminating." Neither Rainier nor Maria caught the double meaning, but Grace savored it like the finest wine. After dinner, as the guests retired to the drawing room, Grace excused herself. "I have some correspondence to attend to," she said. "Please don't let me interrupt your evening." What she actually did was make her way to Rainier's private study, the same room where she had witnessed his betrayal the night before. Grace had many talents, but perhaps the most useful one she had acquired was the ability to pick locks, a skill she had learned from a prop master during her Hollywood days for a film that was never made. Rainier's private safe opened with surprising ease. Inside, Grace found exactly what she was looking for, correspondence with several European banks, documents relating to Monaco's financial agreements with France, and most importantly, a series of photographs that made it clear this affair with Maria Callas was neither recent nor private. But it was the letter at the bottom of the safe that made Grace's hands shake with rage. It was addressed to a lawyer in Switzerland, dated 3 months earlier, inquiring about the possibility of annulment. Rainier had been planning to divorce her for months, waiting only for the right moment to present itself. Grace photographed every document with a small camera she had borrowed from the private investigator. As she worked, she could hear laughter from the drawing room below. Her husband and his mistress enjoying themselves in her home, spending her money, betraying her trust. The old Grace might have cried. The Hollywood Grace might have made a scene. But Princess Grace had learned to think strategically. The next phase of her plan began the following morning, when Grace announced she would be traveling to Paris for a few days to visit friends. "So sudden?" Rainier asked, though he seemed more pleased than concerned. "I haven't seen Josephine Baker in months," Grace lied smoothly. "Besides, I thought you and Maria might enjoy some privacy to discuss her upcoming performances." Rainier's relief was almost comical. "Of course, darling. Take all the time you need." What Grace actually did was meet with the private investigator in a small café near the Sorbonne. He was a thin man with intelligent eyes who spoke in whispers and dealt exclusively in cash. "Your Highness," he said, sliding a manila envelope across the table, "I believe you'll find these quite satisfactory." Inside were photographs that told the story Grace had suspected. Rainier and Maria at restaurants throughout Monaco and the French Riviera. Rainier and Maria entering hotels. Rainier and Maria shopping for jewelry in Ness, where he bought her a necklace remarkably similar to one he had given Grace for their anniversary. But the most damaging photograph was the last one. Rainier and Maria at a lawyer's office in Monte Carlo, clearly planning something they didn't want the princess to know about. "There's more," the investigator said quietly. "Your husband has been moving money, large amounts, from Monaco's treasury into private accounts in Switzerland." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Paris weather. "How much?" "Several million francs. Enough to live very comfortably, even without a throne." Grace understood immediately. Rainier wasn't just planning to divorce her. He was planning to abdicate and run away with Maria Callas, taking enough of Monaco's money to ensure they would never want for anything. It was the perfect plan, except for one thing: he had underestimated his wife. Grace Kelly had given up the most successful acting career in Hollywood to become a princess. She had sacrificed her dreams, her friends, her entire life for Monaco. She had borne Rainier 3 children and served his tiny country with grace and dignity for 6 years. She would be damned if she was going to let him steal everything she had worked for and hand it to an opera singer. That night, Grace made another phone call. This one to the President of France. Charles de Gaulle owed her a favor. During a state dinner 2 years earlier, Grace had quietly prevented a diplomatic incident when a drunken American ambassador had insulted the French president's wife. Grace had smoothly intervened, turning what could have been an international embarrassment into a charming story of American-French friendship. Now it was time to collect. "Monsieur le Président," Grace said in perfect French, "I have some information I believe you'll find interesting." What Grace told de Gaulle was simple. Prince Rainier was embezzling money from Monaco's treasury, money that should have been used to honor Monaco's agreements with France. Moreover, he was planning to abdicate secretly, leaving France to deal with a succession crisis that could destabilize the entire region. De Gaulle was not pleased. Within 24 hours, French financial investigators were quietly reviewing Monaco's books. Within 48 hours, they had discovered irregularities that went back months. Within 72 hours, Rainier received a very uncomfortable phone call from the French finance ministry. But Grace wasn't finished yet. Her next call was to her old friend Cary Grant, who had connections throughout the international press. Within days, carefully planted stories began appearing in newspapers across Europe and America. "Trouble in Paradise is the Monaco marriage on the rocks." Princess Grace, the loneliest woman in Europe. Maria Callas, more than just a house guest. The stories were carefully crafted to generate sympathy for Grace while raising questions about Rainier's behavior. They contained just enough truth to be believable while stopping short of making accusations that could result in lawsuits. Meanwhile, Grace returned to Monaco, her face a perfect mask of serene composure. If Rainier noticed the increased French government interest in Monaco's finances, he gave no sign. If he saw the newspaper stories, he didn't mention them. but Grace could see the stress and the tightness around his eyes, the way he snapped at servants, the frequent private phone calls conducted in hushed tones. The pressure was building and Grace was just getting started. The breaking point came during Monaco's annual Red Cross Ball, the social event of the year that attracted royalty and celebrities from across the globe. Grace had organized the event with her usual meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that every guest, every flower, every musical note was perfect. What the guests didn't know was that Grace had also arranged for several carefully selected journalists to attend, photographers who owed favors to her Hollywood friends, reporters who specialized in celebrity scandals. As the evening progressed, Grace watched Rainier and Maria dance together. They tried to be discreet, but their chemistry was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Grace had made sure several people were looking. At precisely midnight, Grace made her move. She approached the microphone where she was scheduled to give her traditional remarks thanking the evening's donors, but instead of the expected gracious speech, Grace Kelly delivered one of the most devastating public statements in royal history. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly throughout the ballroom, "I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. The Red Cross has always been dear to my heart because it represents something I believe in deeply: the importance of helping those who cannot help themselves." The crowd applauded politely, expecting the standard royal platitudes. "I have dedicated the past 6 years of my life to serving Monaco and its people," Grace continued. "I have given everything I have to give: my career, my homeland, my very identity." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the usual speech. "But I have learned something painful during my time here. Sometimes the people we trust most, the people we love most, are the ones who betray us most completely." The ballroom had gone completely silent. Rainier, who had been dancing with Maria, stopped mid-step and stared at his wife. "I have discovered that my husband Prince Rainier has been conducting an affair with our guest Miss Maria Callas for the past 8 months. Moreover, he has been systematically stealing money from Monaco's treasury to fund their relationship and prepare for a life together after he abandons his responsibilities to this principality." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Guests gasped, photographers snapped pictures, reporters scribbled frantically in their notebooks. Rainier's face went white, then red, then white again. Maria Callas looked as though she might faint, but Grace Kelly wasn't finished. "I have copies of financial records, photographs, and correspondence that document these crimes against Monaco and its people. I have shared this evidence with the French government, the international press, and the Vatican." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Effective immediately. I am requesting that the French government place Monaco under temporary administrative oversight while this matter is investigated. I am also filing for divorce and seeking custody of our children, whom I will be taking to Philadelphia tonight." Grace set down the microphone and walked calmly toward the exit, leaving behind a ballroom in chaos. As she passed Rainier, she stopped just long enough to whisper in his ear, "Checkmate." The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, Rainier had been forced to abdicate in favor of his son Albert, with Grace serving as regent until the boy came of age. The French government had frozen all of Monaco's assets pending a full investigation. Maria Callas had fled to Greece, her reputation in ruins. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome for Grace was the discovery, during the investigation, that Rainier had been planning to have her declared mentally unstable so he could have her committed and take control of her fortune from her Hollywood career. It was a plan that might have worked against any other woman, but Grace Kelly had learned something during her years in Hollywood and Monaco. The most dangerous person in the world is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Grace never remarried. She raised her children in a carefully split custody arrangement, spending half the year in Philadelphia and half in Monaco. She returned to acting briefly in the 1970s, starring in several television movies that reminded the world of her incredible talent. But perhaps her greatest performance was the one she gave on that night in 1962, when she transformed from a betrayed wife into an avenging angel in front of the most powerful people in Europe. Maria Callas never recovered professionally from the scandal. She spent the rest of her life in relative obscurity, her once brilliant career overshadowed by her role in the downfall of the Monaco monarchy. Rainier lived quietly in Switzerland until his death in 2005, supported by what remained of the money he had stolen. He never spoke publicly about the events of 1962, but those who knew him said he never got over the way Grace had outmaneuvered him. In her later interviews, Grace Kelly would say that 1962 was the year she finally learned who she really was. Not a movie star, not a princess, but a woman who refused to be anyone's victim. The fairy tale marriage had been a lie, but the strength Grace discovered in herself was absolutely real. And that strength would define the rest of her extraordinary life. Years later, when asked by a journalist what advice she would give to women facing betrayal, Grace Kelly said something that became legendary: "Never let them see you break, but make sure they never forget the day you broke them." It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, and one she applied with devastating effectiveness. The Ice Princess had melted that night in Monaco, but what emerged was something far more powerful: a woman who understood that the best revenge isn't just living well. Sometimes the best revenge is making sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person wronged you. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments. What would you have done in Grace Kelly's position? Would you have been as strategic, or would you have confronted them immediately? And don't miss our next video, where we reveal another shocking secret from Grace Kelly's life that she took to her grave. You won't believe what we discovered in the Monaco Palace archives. Remember, the most elegant revenge is the one that looks like justice. Grace Kelly proved that sometimes being a lady means knowing exactly when to take off the gloves.